The auctioneer's voice hadn't even hit the first number when Walter Greer spotted the man from Chicago. You didn't need an introduction. The man stood at the back of the crowd in a barn coat that had never seen a barn. Dark green waxed cotton, the kind that costs $300 at a catalog store. Clean boots, a phone in his hand, fingers moving fast. Somebody texting him valuations, most likely. Somebody who did this for a living. Walter was 66 years old. He'd driven 4 hours that morning from Hardin County in a '94 GMC that pulled left on the highway. He hadn't eaten anything since a gas station coffee outside of Ames. He was standing at the edge of a farm auction in Boone County, Iowa, on a Tuesday in October 2003, and he was about to spend money he had arranged, but barely. Because somewhere in that yard, on behind 3 rows of discs and a pile of chain-drag harrow sections, sat a 1951 Farmall M. And inside that M, in the toolbox welded to the left fender, his father had left him something. Before I go any further, I want to be clear about what kind of story this is. What you're going to hear isn't drawn from a single court filing or a newspaper headline. It's a composite, a narrative built from the kinds of events that happened hundreds of times across the Midwest during the decade after the farm crisis. Estate sales, family heirlooms going under the hammer, outside collectors arriving with deep pockets and shallow knowledge. And sometimes, just sometimes, an old man who knew something nobody else in the yard did. The names here are changed. The farm is real in spirit, if not in deed. But the Farmall M, the particular weight of it, I'm the particular meaning of it, that part is as true as anything I know how to write. If you grew up on a farm where a tractor like this one was part of the landscape, I want to hear about it. Leave it in the comments. That conversation matters more than you might think. Walter's father, Gerald Greer, had bought that M new in the spring of 1951 from a dealer in Ames, paid $1,385 for it. That was real money then, more than 2 months' net income for the average Iowa farm family, according to USDA agricultural census records from that period. Gerald had borrowed $600 against a corn crop that hadn't come in yet, and paid the rest in cash he'd been setting aside since 1947. He drove it home 31 miles on the county road, which you weren't supposed to do. The road speed limit for farm equipment was posted at 15 miles an hour. But Gerald held 22 on the flat sections because it was his tractor and he wanted to feel it. That same spring, 14-year-old Walter watched his father pull the M into the driveway on its first morning home. Gerald sat up in the seat drinking his coffee from a thermos lid, letting the engine idle, not in any hurry to get to work, just listening to it. Walter stood on the porch step and watched him and understood, even at that age, that some purchases weren't really purchases. They were declarations. That M worked the Greer farm for 34 years. 212 acres outside of Hubbard, row crops mostly, corn and soybeans, with a small hog operation through the 60s. Gerald never bought a bigger tractor. He bought a 67 IH 706 eventually for the heavy tillage work, but the M stayed. It was the tractor he trained his sons on, the tractor that pulled the grain wagons in from the field every October. The land wasn't there forever. The 1980s took most of it. By 1986, the Greer farm had been reduced from 212 acres to 40. The land went to the bank. The 706 went to a neighbor at a price that still made Walter flinch when he thought about it. But the M, Gerald kept the M, moved it to a shed at his son-in-law's place. Didn't explain why exactly, just said some things weren't for selling. Gerald died in 1998, 81 years old, heart attack, July, in the garden. The M passed to Gerald's daughter, Walter's sister Helen, because it happened to be stored on her husband's property. Her husband was a man named Deckard, cash rent ground, practical to the point of coldness, of no particular attachment to anything that didn't earn its keep. When Walter called him after Gerald's funeral and said he'd like to come retrieve the tractor, Deckard told him it was fine where it was. Not hostile, just dismissive. "It's not hurting anything here, Walter. No rush." Walter had pushed twice more over the following years. Both times Deckard gave him the same answer. And Walter, not wanting to turn a family matter into a legal dispute, not wanting to put Helen in the middle of it, let it sit. He told himself he'd deal with it when things settled. Then Helen died in 2001. Cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to burial. Deckard consigned the M to the Boone County auction without calling Walter first. Walter found out from a cousin who'd seen it listed in an auction flyer, and he called the bank the morning he got that flyer and arranged a small personal line of credit, $1,000, the kind of short-term arrangement a man with a clean borrowing history can set up with a phone call. Then he drove to Boone County. The thing about a Farmall M is that it has a following. Real collectors know it. The M was produced from 1939 to 1952, approximately 269,000 units over those 13 years, according to International Harvester production records archived at the Wisconsin Historical Society. It's the tractor that defined IH's post-war identity in row crop country. The high-arched front axle, the distinctive red paint, the characteristic sound of the C264 four-cylinder engine at half throttle. When IH replaced it with the Super M in 1952, they kept the basic architecture because there wasn't much wrong with it. Collectors who know what they're looking for will travel for a good original. The man from Chicago knew what he was looking for. His name, Walter later found out, was Davenport. He ran a commercial real estate firm out of the Loop. He'd been buying vintage farm equipment for 3 years, mostly for a display barn at his property outside of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. He had a John Deere B, a Minneapolis Moline Z, a Hartpar 1836 that he'd paid $11,000 for at a Grundy County consignment sale. He was, by any measure, a serious collector. He also had a financial advisor feeding him prices on his phone in real time. When the auctioneer got to the M, Davenport moved to the front of the crowd. Walter had seen his father's tractor from across the yard and felt something he didn't have a word for. For it wasn't grief exactly. Grief was something he'd worked through years ago. It was more like recognition. The way you'd feel seeing a photograph of someone's hands that you'd known your whole life. The left rear fender had a crease in it from where Gerald had backed into a steel gate post in 1977. Nobody had fixed it. Nobody had repainted it. The red was faded to something closer to salmon on the hood, deeper near the grill where it had been sheltered from the sun. The toolbox was still there, still latched. Walter stood back from the crowd when the bidding started. His hands were in his jacket pockets, and he was watching Davenport more than he was watching the auctioneer. The opening bid came in at $400. Somebody in a seed corn cap, probably there to flip it. Davenport came in at $6. The seed corn cap went to $7. But Davenport jumped to $9 without flinching. Walter bid $1,000. Davenport looked at him for the first time, assessed him, looked back at the tractor. $1,100. Walter, $12, $13, $14. Walter went to $1,500. That was his ceiling. That was past his ceiling, past the credit line, past comfortable. $1,600, Davenport said. The auctioneer worked the crowd. Nobody else was in it. $17, Walter said. Davenport paused, consulted his phone, made the calculation that Walter was watching him make. $1,800, Davenport said, final answer in his posture. The phone went in his pocket. The auctioneer started his countdown. Going once at $1,800. Walter said $2,000. The yard went quiet in that particular way. Auction yards go quiet when something has shifted. And Davenport looked at him again. This time the look was different. Something like irritation. Something like curiosity. He let it go. $2,000. Going twice? Sold. Afterward, while Walter was writing the check to the estate, Davenport walked over to him. Not aggressive, just a man who wanted to understand something. "You paid over market," Davenport said. It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation. "I know what I paid," Walter said. "That tractor needs work. The magneto's shot. Rear tire on the right side is cracked through." "I know," Walter said. Davenport studied him. "Sentimental value?" Walter signed the check and tore it along the perforated edge. He handed it to the estate administrator without looking up. "Something like that," he said. He waited until the auction was mostly cleared out. But he didn't want an audience for this. When the yard was down to a few men loading equipment onto trailers, Walter walked back to the M, opened the toolbox, and looked inside. There was a coffee can, Maxwell House, red lid, the old style, pushed to the back of the box. His hands weren't entirely steady when he lifted it out. The lid was sealed with electrical tape, the same tan electrical tape Gerald had used on everything. Walter had a memory flash of watching his father wrap the handle of a shovel with that tape in the machine shed, probably 35 years ago. Inside the can was a folded paper bag, and inside the bag was a letter. 4 pages, handwritten on lined notebook paper, dated June 14th, 1994. Gerald's handwriting, slow, deliberate. The letters formed with the care of a man who'd only gone to school through 8th grade and took writing seriously because of it. Walter didn't read it there in the auction yard. He put it back in the can, put the can in the cab of his truck, and drove. He pulled over outside of Ames on the shoulder of Route 30 and read it in the cab with the engine running and the heat on because October in Iowa is cold when the wind is up. Gerald had written about the farm, about what he'd lost and what he'd kept, about the morning in 1986 when the banker called and what that had felt like. Not dramatic, not angry, just the specific weight of it. The sound of the phone being set back in the cradle, the way he'd stood in the kitchen for a few minutes before going back outside because the corn still needed walking. He wrote about Walter's mother, about the M, and why he'd kept it when he'd sold everything else. Not because it was valuable, because some things hold the shape of time in a way that nothing else can, and you keep them because you need that shape. You need proof that the years were real. He wrote, "I know you'll come for it. You were always the one who understood what staying meant." 4 pages, 45 minutes on the shoulder of Route 30 while semis pushed air past the windows. The auctioneer hadn't known any of this. Davenport hadn't known any of this. The estate administrator certainly hadn't known, only Walter knew, because his father had told him in that last summer before Gerald's heart gave out that he'd left him something inside the old M. "Don't let it go without looking," Gerald had said. "Promise me you'll look first." He'd promised. And it had taken him 5 years and an auction notice from a cousin to make good on it. He'd tell himself later that he'd always meant to go sooner, that Deckard had made it complicated. Both things were true. Neither one fully let him off the hook. He'd carry that part quietly. There's a version of this story where Walter is the hero who outwitted the rich man. That version isn't entirely wrong, but it misses the point. Davenport wasn't a villain. He was just a man who didn't know what he didn't know. That's most of us, most of the time, standing in front of something with more history in it than we can read. The real story is about what gets passed down and how, not through wills or estate sales or legal documents, but through the specific gravity of objects that held someone's life. A tractor with a crease in the fender from 1977. And a coffee can with electrical tape on the lid. A handwritten letter to a son who kept his promise, eventually, and drove 4 hours on a Tuesday morning because some things are worth $2,000 you have to borrow. Walter got the M transported back to Hardin County. He had the magneto rebuilt over the winter, found a parts guy in Marshalltown who still knew the older IH systems, fixed the tire, painted nothing. It sits in a shed on a rented 40 he farms part-time. He starts it up every few months, lets it idle. That's all it needs to do now. If you know this kind of story, if you've ever been the person standing in an auction yard trying to buy back something that was already yours in every way that mattered, leave it below. These histories disappear fast, faster than equipment, faster than land. Under this video, you'll see a subscribe button, a small action with a big meaning. By pressing it, you're not only supporting the creation of more content like this, but you're also becoming part of the very exchange we've been talking about, giving and receiving in harmony. It's not about the size of the action, it's about the meaning. A simple subscription tells me these words reached you. It tells me that the effort, the late nights, and the discipline to bring this message forward mattered to someone on the other side of the screen.